Good afternoon. Let me send you a warm hello from Strasbourg and my regrets that we are still not able to meet you in person. My name is Susanne Nikoltchev and I'm the Executive Director of the European Audiovisual Observatory. As you just heard, the observatory functions as reference source for comparative, reliable and independent information on the European audiovisual industry. And because of this, we are regularly asked to set the stage for discussions of topical issues. The Slovenian EU Council Presidency has called on us for the same reason, and we would like to thank the organizers for this double opportunity to share information. Firstly, this conference gives us the chance to shed more light on Article 13 of the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, the key provision on the promotion of European audiovisual works. And secondly, it allows us to present some market context in which this provision will operate. You will get this information through an interview conducted with my colleagues, Maja Cappello and Gilles Fontaine, who are heading our departments for legal information, respectively, market information. Now, as a word of caution, please do not expect them to forecast the impact or even success of the new rules. But you may certainly expect them to share facts and insights resulting from their most recent and even still ongoing research on the subject matter. I will focus my interview questions mainly on VOD, given that this is also the prime focus of the. But I suspect that Maja and Gilles will occasionally add information on other linear services where it might be useful for better understanding. Maja, as a warming up exercise, could you please recall the elements that were introduced by the new Article 13 and compare the resulting rules to those of the previous directive? And ideally, could you also tell us how these elements are to be interpreted according to the Commission's guidelines?
Yes, Article 13 is a provision that concerns the promotion of European works for VOD services and was significantly amended with the revision that was undertaken in 2018 when the new revised directive was published in the official journal. Obligations on VOD services for this matter existed already in the previous directive. They were a bit softer. There was the possibility for the member states to choose among three alternative instruments. The first one was the financial contribution to production or rights acquisition in European works. The second one was to introduce quotas, that is a share in the VOD catalogs. And the third one was prominence obligations. Now, with the change, the Commission has, the European Union, with all these three institutions, have decided to make it a bit more stringent. That is, two obligations that are cumulative: the quota obligation with a minimum share of 30% in VOD catalogs and prominence, leaving the member states free to choose if they want to also include financial contribution obligations, either in production or in direct investments or as contributions to national funds. If they decide to do so, then they can also extend these obligations to targeting services, that is, to VOD services that have their jurisdiction elsewhere, but who direct their services to the audiences in the concerned member state. Now, these rules, of course, bringing in new elements, they require also some degree of interpretation. So the European Commission has adopted a set of guidelines. The first one for the calculation of the share of European works in the catalogs, and the second one introducing some exemption rules for the smaller companies. I will briefly touch upon both issues. The first one concerns the calculation of the share. How do you do that? For linear services, where there is also a quota obligation, or has always been since 1989, that is the minimum obligation of dedicating 50% at least of the transmission time to European works, well, there nothing changes. The unit of measurement is still the transmission time. For VOD catalogs, the reference is to the number of the titles in the catalog. But what is a title? When it is a film, well, then one film is one title. It's a bit different when we talk about series. In that case, one title is one season. And when we come to the question on what do we calculate this, well then in case there are VOD services that operate in more countries, then each national catalog will be the base for calculation. And when it comes to the moment in time, well, member states can choose. They can either do it at every point in time or calculate an average over a predetermined period. When it comes to the exemption rules, there are two cases. The first one concerns the turnover. In particular, there is a presumption of low turnover if this is below 2 million euros. This might be still too much for the smaller markets. So for this case, it is possible to consider less than 1% of the overall revenues of that market, in particular, following the recommendation of 2003 concerning the definition of micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. And last, when it comes to the definition of what is a low audience, then a distinction has to be made according to the different kind of service. In case of subscription-based VOD services, then it's the active paying subscribers that have to be calculated. If the service is bought or rented on a single case-by-case basis, that is transactional VOD, well, then it's the unique customers or unique accounts to be considered. And last, for the advertising-based or VOD services, it's the unique visitors. So the set of rules is quite complex, and it will be now very interesting to see how the member states are actually going to implement this in practice.
Thank you, Maja. Listening to you, it appears that understanding the provisions of the directive becomes very technical. Now, I know that the Observatory's Department for Market Information needed to calculate the share of European works in catalogs as part of the report on their composition. And I think, Gilles, you had, for example, to find out what is included in the VOD catalogs and whether all services dedicate the same share of audiovisual works to European content. Now, can you please tell us more about these two aspects and more generally about the challenges of establishing a methodology for this kind of research?
We do monitor the composition of about 500 European VOD catalogs, and we monitor these catalogs on a quarterly basis. So we have a pretty good representation of what is on offer on VOD in Europe. We get this information either from the services themselves or by VOD portals. With this data, we do two things. On the one hand, we include the information on a title per title basis in our public database Lumière VOD. And that includes information on the country of origin of each work. So that's Lumière VOD, which is a public database and a free database. On the other hand, we also use the information we collect on the composition of the catalogs to analyze the share of European works in VOD catalogs. And we have been doing this for the last 6 years. In the last edition of this annual report, and that was about 2020 data, we found that European works account for about 30% of the VOD catalog. The share is slightly higher for film than it is for audiovisual content. But of course, 30% is on average. And there are strong differences between countries and strong differences between services. It's obvious that VOD services with a focus on European art house cinema have almost by definition a much higher of European works. But there are also many differences among the more mainstream services which can be national or can be global. So 30% on average, but strong differences between services and countries.
Gilles, our entire talk, it seems, is about European content. So I have to follow up with a little question. Can you tell us more about where this content comes from in terms of geography?
Yes, it is not a surprise to see that the largest production countries provide a large share of European works available on VOD catalogs. And we are talking here of the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and to a lesser extent, we are talking about Italy and Spain. What we can say as a rule of thumb is that European works in the largest production countries are primarily national works, whereas in all other countries, the majority of European works are non-national films or non-national TV series.
That's a very interesting perspective, and maybe also a good moment to remind ourselves that there is also a legal definition of what qualifies as European. So I switch over to Maja and ask her to please expand on this.
Yes, indeed, there is a legal definition, and that is not a new one. That dates back to 1989 when at the time, Television Without Frontiers directive ran in parallel with the Convention of the Council of Europe, the Convention on Transfrontier Television, which actually came first. It came in June, whereas the directive came later on in the autumn. And the directive contains in its definitions a link to the convention in the sense that European works are not only those who are originating from the member states, but also from third countries that are parties to this convention, which means that on top of the member states, it's important to look at those who have ratified the convention, which will then also qualify, which is the case, for example, for UK works. And then it is also important to look at another item, which are the co-productions. So when there are co-productions with third countries, which are maybe not parties to the convention, it is important that the majority co-production is in the hands of EU member states. So that can be quite a tricky exercise, absolutely. Good to have maybe a lawyer with you.
Thank you, Maja. So, especially for making a complex scenario sound simple, I would like to come back to another issue concerning catalogs, namely the promotion of European works. And Gilles, I have again questions for you. Are European works prominently displayed? And do we have data on this? And if we do, what do the figures show? Is there any imbalance between the share of European works in catalogs and how visible they are?
To a certain extent, assessing the prominence of European works is more difficult than assessing the composition of catalogs, because there are many ways to make a work prominent. Specific sections, specific search engine present in the home page. At the observatory, so far, we focus on the monitoring of films and TV contents which are advertised on the home page. Another difficulty is that, generally speaking, for transactional VOD services, those services where you can purchase or rent a film or a TV series, for these transactional VOD services, the same works are advertised to all consumers. But this is not the case for subscription-based VOD services, where the homepage of the service is highly personalized. That would mean that tracking promotion could mean virtually tracking the homepage of each individual subscriber, which seems, of course, out of range. So since 2016, we limit ourselves, but that's already a lot, to the monitoring of works advertised on the homepage of transactional VOD services. In our last report, dealing with 2020 data, we found out that there was no major discrepancy, on average, of course, between the share of European works in catalogs and the share of promotion. But to me, the main finding is that due to limitation in the space available to advertise content, limitation of space simply in the home page of the service, only very few works can be actually promoted. In other words, the share of promotion of European works is okay, but is concentrated among a limited number of films which get heavily promoted.
Thank you for sharing some of these challenges raised by the issue of promotion. I think it is now time to address a last question, and I promise you this question is extremely crucial for the success of the promotion of European works, namely, where do we stand with the implementation process? Maja, can you fill us in and possibly already state trends concerning how member states transpose Article 13?
I will give it a try. This is particularly interesting because it's an ongoing process. At the time of the deadline expiry in September 2020, only 4 member states had done the exercise. So there were infringement procedures letters that were sent out by the European Commission. Today, 19 member states have completed the exercise. Not all of them have notified. We are monitoring this closely. We have also a tracker on our website where this can be easily followed. There are still 7 member states in the process of adopting the rules, but this allows nevertheless to already try to identify some trends. So if we take a look at, for example, the state of the art with regard to the implementation of the quota obligations on VOD services, it's possible to see that there is a certain level of prudence. Most member states, they have decided just to stick to the 30%, which is the minimum obligation set by the revised directive. A couple of them have been more ambitious, going from 30 to 40%, and then France as certainly the prize for being the most ambitious one with 60% quota for certain kinds of work. When it comes to the prominence obligations, well, here quite many member states had already adopted rules concerning promotional activities. What has changed is probably that more member states have adopted specific rules. That is not simply stating a general prominence obligation, but also providing some examples of what kind of tools have to be put in place in order to give evidence to the works in the catalog so that they can be easily found. And last, when it comes to the financial investment obligation, here the situation is also interesting because there were some member states that had already been, let's say, forerunners in this regard. They had started implementing the rules on financial obligations also on targeting services even before the deadline of the implementation of the directive. This means that we have a certain number of member states already with some experience. Some are now following with mandatory rules with regard to financial obligations. Many member states have opted not to introduce this obligation, which reflects more or less the choices that had already been made in the past when these rules were alternative to each other. So it will now be important to follow also the developments of secondary legislation, because that is the part where you will get also more details as to which works will in the end benefit from these financing. For example, in the works of independent producers, they are certainly playing an important role in the legislation of many member states. So we will continue following this matter closely.
Well, there is still a long way to go, it seems, but our time is up, and I believe our goal achieved, namely to illustrate some of the issues and challenges related to the promotion of works. We at the Observatory will follow closely the transposition of Article 13 and engage also in observing related market developments. For now, Maja, Gilles, and I wish you a fruitful panel discussion, and we all hope to see you soon in person. Goodbye.